The 90s were a strange decade. It must have been even stranger to be an Everton fan. You've just won the title twice in 3 years, honours in Europe as well, some of the best players in the business and one of the best managers too, and now you find yourself struggling to stay in the top flight. This is Everton and their great escapes of the 90s. Howard Kendall left the club amid the celebrations of the 1987 championship win. The club appointed his understudy first-team trainer Colin Harvey as his successor. An Everton version of the boot room this most certainly was not. There wasn't the depth nor the quality to the Blues' backroom staff, and when it came to rebuilding a squad, Everton didn't nearly have the finances or the scouting know-how to go again. They stayed within the top 8 in Harvey's time, reached a sorrowful cup final in '89, but they could barely have been more removed from those occupying the top of the division, Kenny Dalglish's Liverpool and George Graham's Arsenal. Nobody in their right mind could have caught Liverpool in '88, fair enough, but for as much as the '88-'89 campaign is lauded for its great climax, both Arsenal and Liverpool only returned 76 points. Yes, that's a full 10 behind Everton's '87 vintage and 14 behind their 1985 championship winning tally. The Toffees' record of 8th with 14 wins, 12 defeats and 54 points rendered it their worst season in a decade. The club was in danger of becoming a relic. Signings like Tony Cottee, Peter Beagrie and Norman Whiteside made no sense, club legends leaked out of the club like a faulty tap, and factions between the young and old of Everton left a squad deeply divided. Not even a faint promise of Europe could push the club on into the 90s, as they finished a full 11 points behind the only English representative, Aston Villa. And precisely in spooky season 1990, Goodison Park was treated to a slasher film. Everton were cut from the League Cup by Sheffield United, marooned in 18th after 7 points from their first 10 matches. And they'd replace Colin Harvey and get their new man. A new man, same as the last man. And that was despite rumours of Ron Atkinson, Steve Coppell, Joe Royle and even Franz pissing Beckenbauer. Yeah, it was Howard Kendall back after 2 top 7 finishes in La Liga and a brief run in the UEFA Cup with Athletic Club, as well as a year at Manchester City, which looked to be turning a corner after a mid-table first season. They sat 5th on 12 places and 8 points ahead of Everton when he took the Everton job again. Colin Harvey, meanwhile, just accepted his demotion back to trainer. A man who had virtually no authority as manager now had minus authority as just a coach. Still, results improved to a safe but morbid mid-table finish. It tells a story that Everton's biggest victory of the season came early on in the FA Cup. 3 matches, 5th round, 1 dynasty collapsed, and it wasn't Everton for once.
There will be a replay at Goodison Park on Wednesday. A wonderful save from Bruce Grobbelaar. And who is it that comes in? It's Steve Watson again.
Befitting Everton of the time, the victory meant absolutely nothing. West Ham eliminated them in the subsequent round. The New Age mantra of nowhere in the Cups, nowhere in the League persisted through both the final campaign of the old First Division and the first Premier League season. Despite optimism in signings like Peter Beardsley, despite the return of Howard Kendall, turns out he'd come back to a club in ruins after all. 2 points off the drop zone at the turn of the year in the first edition of the Premier League, only a good start to 93 and a more consistent spring hobbled the Toffees to mid-table. 13th was Everton's worst position since 1981. They had been in the rumours the Liverpool dynasty began to collapse, but simply put, new empires were being built every day. Blackburn were propelled by money, Newcastle propelled by the cult of Keegan, and more sustainably, there was a new club dominating in Manchester United. Everton typically had stood still for so long that they were effectively light years behind where they once were. Not that you'd have said so if you'd have seen the start they made to the 1993-94 Premier League season. 3 wins from 3, Everton top of the league, the club's best start for 15 years. Who cares if they had only played Southampton, Man City and Sheffield United? Well, Newcastle and Arsenal, as well as Aston Villa, cared, as they exacted Everton to 3 defeats, restricting them to 0 goals. The heady days of Tony Cottee grabbing a hat-trick at home to Sheffield United seemed so long ago. It had been 10 days. Evertonians were in for a long old season. Then a trip to Oldham Athletic served to pepper Everton out of their slumber a little before that team across Stanley Park marched across town. And this happened.
Swerve, but McManaman only to mark. Whoa, it's in! And Grobbelaar feels that McManaman, look at this! Here, Tony Cotty still Cotty. The persistence pays off.
Now the season was presumably back on its tracks. Everton could go through and begin their season properly. Mike Walker's Norwich City pitched up at Goodison Park for the next game. It wouldn't be the last time he'd show up at Goodison Park, and it's primarily to do with afternoons like this.
Goal from Everton Cuckoo. Scoops it over at Cuckoo. 2-1. Ball Fox. Cuckoo to his left. Fox shoots. Cuckoo follows up and gets his hat-trick. Cuckoo through yet again. Could be number 4. And it is. Here comes Sutton. And there goes the 5th.
One more win before December with cup failures sprinkled in and amongst. This was the new normal for Everton. Southampton copped a league double, but that was mere brief respite for the Toffees. After climbing from dizzying heights of 13 all the way to 11th, Howard Kendall decided to call it a day. He spent all season trying to sign a striker. Dion Dublin was just the latest cab off the rank, and it was the failure by the board to stretch just £300,000 further to acquire the Man United forward which broke Kendall's time at Goodison. The usual rumours abounded. Atkinson, Royal, former player Peter Reid before the stereotypical big gun got wheeled out by the Red Tops, Bobby Robson, yet again. Ultimately Everton whittled a shortlist down to one man. Yep, Mike Walker. Only problem being that he was busy managing Norwich City. Mike Walker had challenged for the inaugural Premier League title unsuccessfully and paired it off by going toe-to-toe in Europe with names like Inter Milan and Bayern Munich. Flavour of the month, Everton would have to pay for his services. The club were in limbo. 1 month it had taken them to hire a manager, and when it comes to December and the Premier League, everyone knows that's the most hectic month. In the 31 days between Tony Cotty's winner at home to Southampton to a January 3rd trip to Stamford Bridge, not only did the club not win any of the intervening 6 league games, but they failed to score a single goal, in a time where the club were trying to pay out another club's manager but couldn't afford to buy a striker. When Mike Walker finally got hold of Everton, the club had the worst points per game record outside of the bottom 5, 25 games, 25 points, 6 points separate the club from the drop. Even though Mike Walker was able to steer Everton to a first league win in a month, it was over Swindon Town after all. The Toffees quickly corrected that sliver of light at the end of the tunnel with a second successive FA Cup third round exit, this time to Bolton. They were in free fall. Despite their cheaper reconstruction of Goodison Park to fit the Taylor report relative to the cost faced with clubs like Arsenal, Liverpool and Man United, they had kept the purse strings tight and bought very little with it. Anders Limpar was supposed to bring excitement, but didn't. Graham Stewart didn't set pulses racing, and whatever the club thought they were achieving by signing Southend's Brett Angle for £500,000 didn't occur. It was a time where that £500,000 could buy you a live Marcus Gale or Phil Babb or even half an Eric Cantona. They were hardly helped with the club passing from one vessel to another in elongated fashion following the death of John Moores in September '93. A tug of war which would finally become a belated union wouldn't be settled until long after the season. £4 million worth of debt had been accrued. The stadium was half built as the club looked to stem its hurtling towards relegation. An uptick in form was very much welcomed at the start of '94 as Everton toiled through the sludge with wins over Chelsea and Oldham, with draws against Ipswich and Arsenal packed in between. Only problem with those decent 8 points from 4 games, all of them took place at home. Not necessarily a problem in of itself, but given that 8 of their remaining 12 matches would be on the road, it was. Just 9 points separated Everton from a catastrophic relegation to the Football League, and they'd only won away at Southampton, Oldham and Ipswich all season. Some of the grounds they'd have to navigate to included Carrow Road, Hillsborough Villa Park, Upton Park, Loftus Road and Elland Road. Out of the teams that played in those stadiums, only West Ham occupied the bottom half. Oh yeah, and there was a trip to Anfield, and it was next, and it went about as well as you'd expect.
There's Cracky counting it in. Dave Watson scores for Everton. Down at the other end, there's Rush. Ian Rush scores for Liverpool straight away. Plays the ball through to Fowler. Fowler is onside. It's Fowler against Southall. And Fowler has scored for Liverpool.
Then Mike Walker had to return to Carrow Road for his new club's next match, and that also went as you'd expect. And now the club really were in freefall. Spurs beat them, Wednesday beat them, Blackburn beat them, and after a brief return to 3 points at Upton Park, both QPR and Leeds beat them. 8 matches, 1 victory and 1 goal scorer. Everton went into the final day in an incredible amount of trouble. The only thing going their way, the multitude of teams in the great relegation dogfight of 1994. Surely, all of them couldn't win. Every team up to Southampton could still get sucked into the Football League. Southampton, Sheffield United and Ipswich Town all needed to better Everton's result. Whilst the former were paired off with teams in the bottom half in the capital, the Saints with West Ham and the Blades with Chelsea, Ipswich had to go to second place Blackburn. Meanwhile, Everton needed a win and had to hope that one of those 3 teams above them dropped points. They hosted Wimbledon. If they did their job, Oldham's result at Norwich City wouldn't matter. Fate had shined down on the Toffees. They were the only team with home advantage, but each team had an opponent with nothing to play for. The Toffees priced favourably at 11-10 to go down, third favourites behind Oldham and Ipswich, but it started disastrously.
Clark on the near. Limpar just got a touch to that. No, penalty! Handball! Down to Southall. Oh, he very, very nearly made it. Unsworth, 2 together, and Ablett. Clark gets the congratulations on the Wimbledon players.
It didn't matter one bit that both Southampton and Oldham had fallen behind. As long as Everton were behind, they were going down to Division 1.
Penalty. And he has.
And that goal was a kickstarter that the Toffees needed, even if the other teams weren't playing ball. Sheffield United had gone ahead at Stamford Bridge and Southampton had not only tied the Hammers up by half time, but 7 minutes into the second half they were leading. They appeared safe, and even though Ipswich were holding off second place Blackburn to a goalless half-time scoreline, they were the ones poised to fall if Everton could summon another 2 goals. One more was needed. News from London pushed the Blues on. Chelsea had levelled things up against Sheffield United. One end of the bargain was done. Now all Everton had to do was fulfil their end.
Bit of tease from Limpar. Stewart again. Yes! Graham Stewart.
Ipswich Town were down until they weren't, thanks to a Mark Stein goal in the last minute at Stamford Bridge. And that didn't matter to Evertonians. Somehow they had not only escaped the drop zone, but found themselves top of the bottom 6 on 44 points. The blue half of Merseyside could breathe a huge sigh of relief for the summer. Everton had survived by the skin of their teeth, yet English football's reformatting demanded that they were to struggle once again. The Premier League was to be trimmed down from 22 to 20 teams, meaning that 4 outfits would go down from the top flight. Investment could be found both on and off the pitch. The Park End had been rebuilt for £4 million, whilst the summer saw Daniel Amokachi and Vinny Samways signed and Tony Cottee swapped for defender David Burrows. Only the biggest optimist could be excited for the new season. 4 points and no victories from their first 12 league games and a limp elimination from the League Cup by EFL's Portsmouth left Mike Walker on the chopping block. Belatedly, after a goalless draw at Carrow Road, the manager was sacked, quickly replaced by Joe Royle. Formerly a frontman at Goodison Park, Royle both understood the club and had experience in improving what was now an underdog. His managerial career began in 1982 at Boundary Park with an Oldham Athletic that hadn't graced the top flight since 1923. Not only did he return them to the top tier, he kept them there and took them to Wembley for the 1990 League Cup final, whilst getting to within 90 minutes of an FA Cup final not once but twice. Royle would grab hold of Everton, toughening them up, quickening them up both in and out of possession, and instilled a philosophy that would become known as the Dogs of War. They were named after the combative 3-man midfield of Barry Horn, John Ebrell and Joe Parkinson, but could quite easily be stretched to new loan signing Duncan Ferguson, who had slowly but surely captured the imagination of the Gladys Street end. Andy Hinchcliffe was transformed into an English international, and as Limpar was finally showing his creative streak, and Paul Rideout enjoyed his greatest season for the Blues. Royle's first game had been the biggest of the season, the home Merseyside derby in the Premier League, one hell of an acid test.
Hinchcliffe's corner. Just Ferguson has put Everton in front here. Ferguson goes up, there's a crazy deflection, it might fall the right out. He scored, that's 2.
A solid foundation of 11 points from his first 5 matches before Christmas led Everton out of the drop zone in January. Despite the epitome of inconsistency in the league, it was enough to be safe well in advance of the final day. Plus, the season had been buoyed by a cup run bolstered by a sticky victory away at Bristol City in the 4th round. Norwich City were next, a team that handed Everton a few spankings in the past and a team who the Toffees had pinched their previous manager off. What happened next sparked the remainder of the season.
Great angle ball, Stewart, good first touch, he must score, he does, and that completes the rout. Aims for the head of Ferguson, nods it down, Watson's in there, Hottiger in trouble, and Watson has scored! Cernicek couldn't keep it out.
I don't think Limpar really saw him. He plays Amlet in on the left, Amakachi's in the middle, surely number 4, yes!
Jackson into the area, he's unselfish, Stewart strikes the bar, Rideout scores. Took it brilliantly well.
Everton were FA Cup champions. They went big in the transfer market to sign players like Craig Shaw, Andrei Kanchelskis and finished 6th whilst acquitting themselves decently enough in Europe. Joe Royle was doing what he had done to Oldham. Everton now a team transformed. They continued to be ambitious, acquiring Gary Speed, Nick Barmby whilst also planning for their goalkeeping future with Paul Gerrard. Challenging for Europe again as 96 became 97, a trip to the Riverside derailed everything. 6 league games were lost on the spin. Not only had Everton been dumped out of the League Cup by York City, but they'd also gone down in the FA Cup to lower league opposition in Bradford City before winding up in 15th place. An injury crisis with Dave Watson, Craig Shaw and Andy Hinchcliffe at the heart of it, poor returns in the transfer market from players like Mark Hottiger, Terry Phelan and Klaus Thompson, combined with a downturn in form for big players like Limpar and Kanchelskis, it all meant a return to the Everton doldrums. That March, Joe Royle had been sacked, or resigned, depending on who you listen to. It all fell in a similar vein to how they lost Howard Kendall the second time around, as Royle smarted over the failure by the club to purchase Torre-Andre Flo for just £1.2 million. With Dave Watson tiding the team over until the summer, Goodison Park needed a new manager. Everton were being left behind both on and off the pitch. Their stadium was very much of the 20th century, whilst footballing monuments to the following century sprouted up around the country in less renowned places like Middlesbrough, Bolton and Sunderland. The club had become boring, they'd become old-fashioned, they'd become typical Everton again. So when you're behaving typically at Goodison Park, you begin with the lofty ideals of bringing in a world-class manager like Bobby Robson, Arrigo Sacchi or John Toshak. Typical Everton means missing out on those names obviously and settling on a return. Bewildering this time, it was Andy Gray who effectively had been named the manager in the summer of 1997. Then he got cold feet, renewed his contract as a pundit and commentator with Sky Sports, and Everton had to lean on a man they knew couldn't turn them down. Howard Kendall, Part 3. If they weren't the Mersey millionaires in the mid-80s and they couldn't acquire the talent in the early 90s, then come the advent of the next millennium, Howard Kendall certainly couldn't boast a war chest to rival that of what were supposed to be their Big Five rivals who were competing at the top of the table. They went for players like Paul Ince, Fabrizio Ravanelli and Teddy Sheringham. They got John Oster, Tony Thomas and Gareth Farrelly. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. By the time Liverpool had turned up to Goodison Park on October the 18th, the long and short of Everton's happy times in the 1997-98 campaign were home wins over West Ham and Barnsley, as well as a draw in their last Goodison outing against Arsenal. But the cliche goes that the form book goes out of the window when a derby match comes along.
Archie right in front of James, who towers above him. Oh, no goal from Ruddock! Through, he's turned inside, goes for the shot, scores! It's Everton 2, Liverpool 0.
So after that, why was the mood around the club so dire? Why would the Toffees not win again until Christmas week? 4 days prior to that glory over Liverpool, the beginning of the end of Howard Kendall's third tenure played out in a League Cup elimination at Highfield Road. Not for the elimination itself or of the ludicrously bad performance and 4-1 defeat to Coventry City, a team far more stable than they in the Premier League, but for the old school nature of Howard Kendall's public dressing down of his players. Ashamed by the loss, the manager held court with his players digging them out on the Coventry turf post-match. For a sport that had moved on, Kendall's old school nature had rubbed plenty of players the wrong way, which included Gary Speed, who couldn't wait to depart for Newcastle afterwards. Either side of that departure, Andrew Hinchcliffe left for Sheffield Wednesday, and the distinguished Evertonian career of Neville Southall was ended ignominiously in March. Therefore, Kendall had to harness players who were younger and more pliable, enter names like Michael Ball, Richard Dunn and Danny Cadamatri. And whilst Kendall's plundering of his former club Sheffield United didn't pull up much trees in Mitch Ward and Carl Tyler's November acquisitions, Don Hutchison's signing in February came after an improvement to Everton's fortunes. Leicester, Crystal Palace and Chelsea all beaten either side at Christmas. The most important, however, came at home to Bolton Wanderers, which would have ramifications for both clubs for the next few years.
Thomas puts the cross in. Ferguson! Good run from Andy Hinchcliffe. Out to Barnby. Ferguson! And they have done! Shot comes in. It's a high-heading cross. And Ferguson!
They'd been dredged out of the drop zone. Howard Kendall even won Manager of the Month, and everything looked rosy again. The Toffees in 13th place, closer to the top half than they were relegation, and crucially, armed with momentum. Then travels to Upton Park and Oakwell chipped away at Evertonian confidence. A surprise package in Derby pitched up on Merseyside and went home with all 3 points, and whilst a point was gleaned from a trip to Anfield and another draw was taken from a decent Newcastle United side, momentum had been removed. Such is the nature of a relegation dogfight. Everton's 6-game winless run had kept the status quo of a 5-point gap to the drop zone, even if the Toffees had dipped to 16th. Then a trip to the Dell took fate out of Everton hands for the first time. The gap to Barnsley was now just 2, and the South Yorkshire side had a game in hand, with the buffer of Tottenham Hotspur between the pair. When Everton got a slender triumph over Blackburn on March 14th, both Bolton and Barnsley matched it. When Everton were hammered at home to Aston Villa 2 weeks later, Bolton crept back into the conversation as they beat Leicester. 3 days later, Everton's rivals had their long-dreaded games in hand. Thankfully, the evening of March 31st passed, and the Blues were still on the right side of the dotted line. When Everton finally won a game impressively at home to Leeds via Hutchison and Ferguson goals, the irritations underneath them would not relent. Bolton victorious over local rivals Blackburn, Barnsley and a similarly charged derby against Sheffield Wednesday. The Toffees had leapt up to 15th but still remained at arm's length, whilst Barnsley fell into the oblivion thanks to their fixture list that saw defeats to Newcastle and Arsenal. Bolton stayed alive by beating both Aston Villa and Crystal Palace. April 25th, therefore, with Everton due to be served to Arsenal for their title procession the following week, it meant they had to get points on the board when Sheffield Wednesday visited Goodison Park.
Has to get the cross in, does Pembridge 1-0 to Sheffield Wednesday. Clearing their lines, but not well. Oh, a deflection there, I think. Oh, look at that. Fleet foot. It must be a goal, surely. It's almost like a practice session, this.
And then, after Tony Adams predictably summed it all up and Everton had to watch Arsenal lift their Premier League title, the Toffees had finally bottomed out into the drop zone. Bolton had hit the magical 40-point mark, but weren't safe. And yet, given the final day of fixtures, they were arguably favourites to escape the drop. They did have to travel to 4th place Chelsea, but they had other things to think about. A Cup Winners' Cup final 3 days later, in Stockholm for instance. Meanwhile, Coventry were coming to Goodison and were in 11th place with no inhibitions and a points tally of 51 that spoke of a team unfortunate not to qualify for Europe. And yet, it couldn't have started better for Everton.
Gets to it strongly, got for Calling again! Barnby takes on the responsibility. Coventry feel that justice has been done.
Goodison Park waited with bated breath. A goal in the white of Bolton down in London, or for the visitors at Goodison, would send the Toffees down. Then news from Stamford Bridge. Jody Morris had scored and Everton were safe with a final whistle at home Safe for now, but far, far from stable. And Howard Kendall, yesterday's man, had to go, so Everton went down the normal route, going after people they couldn't get in Martin O'Neill, Ron Atkinson yet again, and Brian Kidd before settling on Walter Smith. A man who had lifted 7 Scottish League titles with Rangers and a litany of cups to boot. In a normal landscape he might have been sought after by the best of the absolute best clubs, but up north, Smith's Rangers ran almost unopposed against the Celtic side on a financial road to ruin, hence why Everton were able to capture him in the first place. What he delivered to Goodison was a sense of life, at first, when names like Marco Materazzi, Olivier Decourt and John Collins came to the club and David Unsworth returned. Kevin Campbell was a difference maker, coming in late on in the 98-99 season, scoring 9 goals in the club's final 4 wins that sealed survival. But soon enough it'd be players like Duncan Ferguson departing, and it'd be old names cashing cheques as opposed to young, hungry players winning games. Once players like Thomas Gravesen, Kevin Campbell and David Weir kept the club ticking over, people like David Ginola, Paul Gascoigne and Mark Hughes would be a hindrance more than anything. Whilst Francis Jeffers breathed life into the club, Ibrahima Bakayoko was a walking disaster and an expensive one at that. Ultimately, Smith wasn't able to get his project off the ground as the club never even reached the top half or embarked on a cup run. Nor, it has to be said, were they ever really embroiled in a relegation dogfight, certainly not to the same extent as 94 or 98. Football had changed, Everton's income no longer stood in the upper echelons of the English game. There they were playing 20th century football in the completely wrong millennium. They'd changed ownership late in the day in 99, but the same problems remained, and it'd take someone pretty special to take Everton back into the conversations they thought they should be in. They were a long way from the good old days of winning championships. Luckily, we've got the videos documenting those wins.